All stand, please. Please be seated.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Your Honour. Now, Mr. Gilmore, before lunch we'd gotten onto the topic of the burning route again, but I'd just like to go back a little bit and give some context and try and approach this in as structured a way as possible. Do you recall before lunch that I had put to you a proposition to the effect that, based on all of the information that you've accumulated in respect of this fire, the most probable explanation for the ignition of the faucet bushfire was the mechanism identified by the TFS in their report?
I remember you putting that to me, so yes.
Now, as I understood your evidence shortly before the lunch and adjournment, you were hesitant to accept that proposition for what I'm going to identify as three reasons. Firstly, you referred to the issue of the indicators as to fire direction in the what we'll call the area of the big log. Am I right? That's the first factor you identified?
Yes, we covered that, yes.
And then secondly, although you seemed to include this a little bit in the first factor, but I'll deal with it separately. Secondly was the indicators within the area of origin that you said suggested that there had been a movement of fire across the area of origin from south toward the north rather than west towards the east.
Yes.
All right. And then the third factor that you identified was that you at least referred to the possibility that the burned route that the TFS had identified and excavated was a consequence of the fire, not a cause of the fire.
Yes.
Now, have I identified there all of the factors that cause you to be reluctant to accept the proposition that the most probable cause of the ignition of the faucet bushfire was the mechanism identified by the TFS?
Well, I was just about to say yes, but there is a small patch in the area of origin in the northeast corner where the majority of indicators come back towards cone 20 rather than the other direction as well. So it's a slightly different direction from the north to south. In fact, it's almost totally the opposite.
Right.
So that's the only other thing I'd add, which, I suppose it falls in the same category, that the area of origin between the two pink painted lines, basically,
okay.
The area, the direction is inconsistent with that.
All right. So with the addition of that fourth item, are those the four factors that cause you to be reluctant to accept the proposition that I've identified?
I think so, yes.
All right, thank you. Now let's deal with them in order. Let's start with the area between the big log and the far side of the cleared septic area.
Yep.
We spent some time on this yesterday, you recall.
Yes.
Now, I put to you before lunchtime that well, I'll withdraw that. I put to you now, Mr. Gilmore, that your observations as to the different directions of fire travel in that area, log/septic, firstly, might simply be wrong. Do you accept that possibility?
Oh, that's always a possibility, sir. Okay. People are wrong, yes.
And secondly, although you might be right as to the direction of fire travel at different locations, those areas might have been burned later in the fire rather than as the point of origin. Would you accept that possibility?
It's possible if we ignore people defending the septic lines at an earlier time.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, I took you yesterday to the evidence of Mr. Robinson, Mr. Butler, Ms. Barrett, Mr. Walkley and Mr. Bones, all of whom were to the effect that that area of the log and septic had been burned later in the course of the fire. It had not been burning at the time that the fire initiated. It was not implicated in the ignition of the fire.
Now,
Do you recall that?
Your Honour, the material that Mr Armstrong took the witness to indicated that. It shouldn't be suggested as part of the question that, for example, Mr Robinson, all of his indicated that. So what was put to the witness was a selection of material.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mr Armstrong, I'm just wondering, is there a lot of point in traversing this ground again?
Well, Your Honour, I'm just trying to get I'm trying to address each of the factors that Mr Gilmore relies on to resist the essential proposition. I can probably, given how much...
If I make those findings, I will find that Mr Gilmore is wrong.
Yes.
And the evidence for making those findings exists.
Yes.
But I was thinking about this at lunchtime. Basically, you're asking Mr Gilmore to say, well, if all those factors that cause you concern in agreeing with the TFS were absent, would your opinion be different?
Yes.
But if I make all of those findings, Mr Gilmore's opinion might still be the same. He would just say that I'm wrong.
Yes, Your Honour, I take the point there. Well, I'll try and deal with this more briefly then.
Mm-hmm.
I won't revisit that issue about the log and the septic area, Mr Gilmore. We dealt with that at length yesterday. There was one further issue in that list of 4 factors that I beg pardon, 2 now, that I need to discuss with you. Firstly, could Mr Temponi please bring up Court Book Document 101? And just to give you context, Mr Gilmore, I'm now turning to the second factor that we've identified a moment ago, and that is the notion that the fire that crossed the area of origin was moving from south to north rather than the other way or east to west. Could Mr Temponi please take us to, oh dear, I don't have the number. Can we go up to the top of the list of photographs and photograph 6, please, Mr Temponi. Now, Mr Gilmore, I think you were shown this photograph either on Monday afternoon
yes,
or
I remember
yesterday.
that. Yes, yes.
Now, looking at the tussock in the foreground of the photograph, I think you were asked about this. And Mr Gilmore, Dr Marsden Smedley gave evidence to the effect that he considered that the explanation for the burn pattern that we see on that tussock was more likely to be that the fire had approached the tussock as a low intensity burn from a generally northerly side. The low flames had crept into the tussock, where the northern edge of the tussock had then provided a little bit of a windbreak to what was on its southern side, and that meant that the flames having passed through the northern edge of the tussock were then sheltered and able to burn for longer on the part of the tussock south of the north edge, and therefore the burn pattern on the tussock indicated a direction of fire travel from broadly a northerly or northwesterly direction toward a southerly or southeasterly direction. Now, would you agree that that is a plausible explanation for the burn pattern that you see on the tussock?
I understood his explanation fairly well. I don't agree for a few reasons. So the phenomena he's describing is normally fallen leaves around a shrub of head high below is quite often how it happens, with very little fuel underneath. The leaves fall and form a donut of fuel around. Sometimes that will give the effect that he described. The other thing with this particular tussock is the amount of fuel that's burnt to the north of it. So it's apparent to me the amount of fuel that's burnt by the amount of white ash that's there showing to the north of the tussock. So there's been quite a lot of fuel there. It doesn't appear to have been solid fuel or something that would have been slow to ignite. And there seems to be quite a bed of ash to the north of that tussock to me. So I don't agree.
All right. So when you say a bed of ash to the north of the tussock, do you mean immediately to the right of the blackened base of the tussock on the photograph?
So there's quite a collection of ash, perhaps within a metre or something like that.
Yep.
In a fashion there. Yes.
And so on that hypothesis, Mr. Gilmore, I take it that you're effectively assuming that the fire is travelling from left to right and presumably under the influence of a wind blowing from left to right. Is that right?
Slightly to the bottom of left to right. So it's on a slight angle there, with the remaining stems being at the back of where the fire has approached from. So the back of the clump is protected by the amount of moisture in the clump as the fire approaches it.
Right.
The front is dried out and burnt, and then the back remains.
Well, just to understand what you're saying there, Mr. Gilmore, we could probably fairly confidently assume that the fronds of tussock across the whole of that base were a relatively consistent mix of slightly green and more dried out fronds, similar to what we see in the surviving part of the tussock, can't we?
I think it is likely to have been greener than what it appears now, so there will have been some drying caused by the fire.
Right, so the whole of the tussock, you think, before the fire would have been slightly greener than what we see in the surviving part?
Yes, I think so.
All right. And your hypothesis is that the fire has moved from effectively the bottom left-hand side of the photograph broadly toward the right of the photograph,
yes.
Correct? And the reason why you say that the fronds on the left-hand side of the tussock burned is because they were dried out by the fire as it approached?
Yes.
Right. And that fire was being driven in that direction by wind?
Could have been wind or fuel driven to move it,
Okay.
Yes. But
And
I would
you
expect it to have some wind behind it,
Right.
yes.
And you would agree with me, Mr. Gilmore, that by the time this fire that you hypothesise had reached what I'll call the southern side of the tussock, when it reached that southern part of the tussock, it found a particularly good jackpot of fuel, to use your phrase yesterday. Agreed?
Yes, the tussock is plenty of available fuel, yes.
So the fire moving in that direction has moved from the area to the left of the tussock where there was relatively little fuel. It has hit the tussock and then found a jackpot of good fuel to burn, correct?
There's certainly more fuel in the tussock than the surrounding area.
Right. And I put it to you, Mr. Gilmore, that it would then follow that if the fire on the left of the tussock was able to be ignited by the low intensity burn passing across the ground to the left of the tussock, then the burning left side of the tussock would have been very likely to have had a similar curing effect on the right side of the tussock, and that combined with the intensity of that burn combined with the possibility that that's the direction of wind travel means it is extremely likely that the burning on the left side of the tussock would have leaned across, dried out and incinerated even the surviving fronds of the tussock.
If that was the case, I would expect there to be more burnt on the left-hand side of what's remaining if it had passed across adjacent to it.
All right. And I put it to you, Mr. Gilmore, that in fact the more plausible explanation for what we see in that tussock is that a low-intensity burn has approached it from essentially the right-hand side, has passed through a relatively green northern edge of the tussock where it's then been sheltered from the prevailing wind, and as it's ignited the sheltered part of the tussock, the flames have been blown away from the northern edge fronds by the wind, and that's the reason why the northern edge fronds have survived. but the southern side fronds have all been incinerated.
I don't think so, sir.
All right. Now, I don't want to go back to the root as a consequence rather than a cause of the fire. We discussed that yesterday and this morning. The fourth factor that you've mentioned as the reason for resisting the proposition that the TFS got it right is what you've referred to as the direction of fire in the northeast corner of the area of origin. Could Mr. Tempone please, within Court Book Document 101, please take us perhaps to photograph 63 again. And if we can zoom into the area of origin, please, Mr. Tempone. A little bit further, that's about it. And now just could you indicate for His Honour, please, Mr. Gilmore, what's the northeast corner that you're referring to?
Yeah, I'd think if we go to the left, Mr. Tempone, yeah, so the area, probably if we drew, yeah, go across the road, it's probably the easiest way to do this.
Sorry, can I just pause you, Mr. Gilmore? If we're going to draw, then Mr. Tempone, you know the drill. Can we take a screenshot?
So yeah, if you go straight out to the road, Mr. Tempone, yes, and to the edge where the road meets the driveway, sorry, meets the grass. So go to the right, stop, yes, go down, stop, yeah, and now what I'm going to do is ask you to go to the pink line that's to your right now. So if you can move just slowly along that, and I'll choose point. Sorry, the one that goes across is where I was trying to aim you. Yes, if you keep going along there, stop there, go up to where the pink tape has a pole straight above you. Yeah, there, and then straight back out to the left to the driveway. Sorry, no, higher than that. Yeah, straight out, yes. So in that box there are several indications of fire moving from the top left of that box towards the bottom right.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Tempone, can you then mark that photograph, and I'll tender that as well, Your Honour. Now, Mr. Gilmore, you referred in your evidence at one point this morning to the idea of fingers of fire. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And if one imagines a fire igniting in the area of origin, somewhere between the red box that you've just marked and the vicinity of the two stumps that we see in the photograph, then, and you imagine the conditions on 3rd of January 2013, a fire ignited in the fuel that you would expect to be in that area would, within a very short time, start to develop an overall direction of travel influenced by the westerly wind so that it was running in an easterly direction, correct?
Yes, if...
Thank you. That yes will do. Thank you, Mr. Gilmore.
Well, it has some
Now
other
that
parts
fire,
to it, so...
And that fire would also back slightly into the wind?
Yes.
And the fire would also have flanks that moved broadly laterally to the wind?
Yes.
Certainly the flanks, in fact all directions of fire travel would depend on available pathways of fuel.
Fuel and weather, yes.
And by weather you mean the fact that the dry leaf litter and burning grass in the relatively strong and gusty winds across that relatively flat area would be likely to throw burning material a very short distance ahead of the fire and create effectively tiny little spot fires that the spreading fire might then catch up with.
That's possible, yes.
Okay, and so one of the notions of fingers of fire that you referred to this morning is an expectation that an early fire igniting in an area like this would end up with a burn pattern that, although it might generally be slightly conically shaped or V-shaped, is also going to spread from side to side and might back into the wind as fingers, wouldn't it?
No, the backing generally not as fingers. The running, and in fact the shape of a hand is quite often the shape if you have a fire that's fingering a lot, and it's caused by the fire stopping at various places. And then the fingers are drawn together by convection and form junction zones, which are areas of more intense fire again.
Right. And in the area that you've indicated, signs of the direction of fire travel moving back towards the bottom of the photograph would be consistent with the movement of backing fire, not just running fire, I put it to you.
Yes, it is indicators of backing fire in that part. Yes.
All right, thank you. Now, lastly, I hope, Mr. Gilmore, can I ask you to consider this proposition, namely that the possible explanations for the ignition of the Fawcett bushfire can be regarded as a binary option. One of those options being that the TFS essentially got it right, and the alternative being that there was some other explanation for the fire. Do you accept that?
Yeah, that's a proposition, yes.
Right. And you have, I put it to you that based on all of the information available to you, all of the positive evidence as to what might explain the ignition of the Fawcett bushfire, overwhelmingly the most probable explanation consistent with the balance of the evidence is that the TFS got it right. And I take it that you disagree with that?
Yes, I disagree with that,
Right.
sir. Yes, for the reasons
So you say that it was something else?
Yes, I'm not saying I know what it is,
Right.
but I disagree with the finding, yes.
And to be clear, you've got no idea what the alternative might actually be?
No.
Thank you. Thank you for attending to my questions. Mr. Gilmore, nothing further, Your Honour.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Reid.
Could we have document 192 up, please, Mr. Tempone? Now, could you take a screenshot of that, but cut it off about mid-house, so from the top down to about mid-house? Yep, that's sufficient, thank you. Now, Mr. Gilmore, I want to take your attention to the red box and the yellow arrows and evidence that you gave in relation to fire movement in that area, the area to the north of the red box. Mm-hmm. Can you please get Mr. Tempone with a teal marker to place some arrows in the directions that your observations of the photographs and the fireground led you to conclude?
So that's just on the fireground or using the photos as well?
Yeah, using the photos as well. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Tempone, if we could go to the middle of the red box, please. Now, what I wish to do is draw an arrow up in the top right of the box, diagonally out through the corner of the box, so that the arrow head is sort of on the corner of the box there. and comes, yeah, so that's the arrow head, yep, and then a diagonal 45 line, only about half that length.
We might have to change the pen colour, Mr. Tempone. That one's not as nice as I thought it'd be. Aqua, that's much more like it.
Then another one from about a third of the way down the shaft of the green arrow. Yeah, exactly right, well done. Now, where I'm wanting to head is up just to the left of the yellow arrow as we come out of the box, so slightly off vertical. And heading, there's a black leaning stump just outside the red box you can see. I'd like to go straight over the top of that from that location we started at. So is that obvious to you? Sorry, a little bit further towards the base of the shaft of the arrow. Yeah, yep, round about there. And now I want to go up through the top left corner of the box, but slightly to the right of the top left corner, if that makes sense. And there's a black stump just outside that box. Yes, through there, yes. So, and with an arrow head on it there. That's pretty close, yes. Then other observations of fire travel were generally around the bottom of the red box heading down. So what we would normally do is just draw some little like sawtooth arrows around the extremity. I'm not sure if we're aware totally of the burnt area yet, whether that's any use, but it's obvious there. There's like a dome underneath the red box, and that's the burnt area. It starts at each corner of the box. So
Just wait for you.
Yeah, so that's outside the burnt area. If you could draw the same thing sort of along the bottom of the red box, that would indicate it. And just 3 V's, or yes, V's along the bottom of that box. So if we could have a go again and just make those more pronounced sort of V's. So there's 3 along that. That's just the sort of thing that I'm used to. And just noting that they've gone slightly outside the burnt area. That's fine. I'm happy with that indication that that's what shows there. The area up above the red box and go to the left and further to the left and further to the left, so we're in the middle of that, yes, that bare area. Go a little bit further up and now a diagonal to the top, to the left arrow from there. So just the shaft the same length as the arrow sides. So starting there, going up on 45 degrees to the left, just a short distance. Yep, and then draw a head on that. Sorry, the other way. Sorry. Thank you. Do you wish to draw the other arrows that we've been talking about?
Well,
in a pink area?
If we can bring document 15 up, please. And if we go to figure 9, now you see there your figure 9.
Yes.
Have you replicated figure 9 already in the drawings?
It's that last arrow we drew.
Yes.
Was an attempt to align with those 2 arrows on the left of figure 9.
Thank you. And figure 8, please. I'm sorry, I've got the wrong figure.
No,
No, just, oh, yeah, there we are.
Base there, it didn't have the arrows. They've,
Yes.
they've appeared.
Right.
Yes. Now, have they been given depiction in the document that you're working with?
Yes. So what we're looking at now is sort of across the red box. So, thank you. So yeah, we're looking from, if we look at the red box, if we look from the bottom right to the bottom left, that's the orientation of this photo, and that's what I was trying to represent by that initial blue arrow coming up out of the box. So the box is drawn, the photo on the right, which is figure 8, is that what it was?
Yes.
It shows about half the area of that red box.
So the arrow, the base of which joins the green arrow, the base of the green arrow, that's the equivalent of...
That's meant to represent these
Yes, figure 8.
things in more finer detail that show in that photo, yes.
Thank you. Now, thank you. You were asked about... Yes, I attend to that. And if we could have MG10 back, please. You drew, well, you've got one hatch on there, and that was to indicate areas where there were several indicators of fire travel.
Yes.
Can you please tell His Honour what those indicators were? If you can do it by reference to this photograph, well and good, but otherwise describe them, please.
They are mostly fallen grass stems, pointing in a direction sort of equivalent to bottom right to top left of that photo, the red box, demonstrating that fire travel had been a backing fire, moving from the top left of that box back towards the bottom right, in a general sense. There's some width to them too. They're not just in a little line, so it's like there's a backing fire through there.
Thank you. You were asked for reasons why you, in effect, rejected the TFS thesis. Do you take account at all of the observations made by Ms. Barrett of the place and direction of fire travel when she first saw it in reaching your opinions?
Well, the only thing is the dimensions of the fire were incorrect for the wind recorded at that time. So,
you mean the dimensions as described by her?
Yes, yeah. So the fire should have been a narrow curve, because what we're talking out in this area that is the centre of that photo is grass. It's grassland. It's got a few little bits and pieces of other things. There's the 2 reeds that are still visible. There's some a disturbed bare area over on the right of the taped off area, which is pretty visible. But basically, this area in the centre and to the upper part of the photo, once you're out away from the trees, is grassland. And so grassland is probably 4 times, something like that, more affected by wind in a straight cigar-shaped sort of sense than a forest fire, because of where the wind comes from. So the wind comes from above. And so it comes down into the forest through the canopy. So if there's a gap in the canopy here in this room and the wind's coming this way, you would expect there to be more burning over that side, where the wind doesn't go across the landscape like this. It keeps tripping over and falling into the landscape, and that's how it works. So,
do you take account at all of Ms. Barrett's observations that the fire was creeping back rather than going in the direction of the green arrow?
Well, it's consistent with that inside that red box, those indicators, that it's backing fire. Yes.
Yes, please. It was, you tended MG10, I think. I think MG10 was 10. Yes, I'm getting a nod. Yes, thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
I seek the relief of Mr. Gilmore.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Gilmore, for your attendance. You're
Thank you, Your
relieved on the trial, which means you're free to go, or you can stay if you want to.
Thank you very much.
Now, Your Honour, a couple of matters. First of all, I'm pleased to say that the parties have agreed quantum of the test plaintiff, so there's no need for Your Honour to be troubled about that.
Thank you. We'll just let Mr. Gilmore beat an orderly retreat.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you. No, we should have done that as a matter of courtesy.
Yes, quantum's been agreed for the test plaintiff, so there's no need for Your Honour to be troubled about that. And that is the case for the defence.
Yes, thank you. So, obviously, Mr. Daly's not being called.
No, Mr. Daly's not being called.
Okay, well, I understand we have a timetable that's satisfactory to council.
Yes, Your Honour. I think that's, from memory, it contemplates that written submissions will be exchanged Thursday next week.
27th?
Yes, and then I think we return on to trouble Your Honour a bit further on Wednesday the 2nd.
Wednesday the 2nd of June.
Yes.
All right, well, in that case, I will adjourn until 10 a.m. on Wednesday the 2nd of June.
Thank you, Your Honour.
All right, thank you.
Please stand, please. This honourable court now stands adjourned.